Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Tokyo International University Global Dialogue. My name is Akitoshi Miyashita, Dean of TIU English Track Program and Professor of International Relations. Today, we will be discussing the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the event that shook the world. It's still going on for over 2 months now. Causing thousands of casualties and serious refugee program. With me today are 5 renowned IR scholars with different backgrounds, expertise, and it is my great pleasure to introduce them to you. So let me start with Chris. Chris Lamont, Associate Professor at TIU, and he's a specialist on human rights, transitional justice, among others. Next to Chris is Medlir Mama, Associate Professor here at TIU, specializing in international law, international organizations. Next to Medlir is James Brown, Associate Professor at Temple University, Japan, and he's a specialist on Japan-Russia relations and Russian foreign policy. Next to James is Kyoko Hatakeyama. She's a professor at the University of Niigata Prefecture, and she's a specialist on Japanese defense foreign policy and international relations of Asia. And finally, sorry, your name tag. We have Honig, Associate Professor here at TIU. He's a specialist on international security, terrorism, and the Middle East. I would like to proceed our roundtable as follows. First, I would like to pose several questions to our panelists, and we have some discussion. After that, I open the floor for any questions or comments. You're welcome to ask any question to anyone or all of the panelists. And then I know we have some audience listening or watching this via webinar. So I would like to take some questions from the webinar audience. So without further ado, I would like to start. My first question is very simple. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? We have to start from this question, and I would like to ask further questions relating to this. But what do you think that some of the important causes that drove the Russia into Ukraine? James, would you like to start off?
Certainly, thank you very much. So I think if we look at the causes of this decision, there are all sorts of factors that could be mentioned. I won't run through all of them. Instead, I'll just focus on one of them, and that's the decision-making process itself. So I very much see this as a huge historic mistake by the Russian leadership in taking this decision. It's disastrous for Russia economically. It has very negative strategic implications for them as well, and actually poses a threat to Putin's continued rule. So my way into looking at this is to try and work out how such a major error in decision-making occurred. And one way of thinking about that is to consider what you need in order to make good foreign policy decisions. For that, you need, I think, a multiplicity of views being discussed. You need honest advice being given to the leadership. You need some form of checks on the leadership so the very bad decisions are not made. You also need good intelligence from your intelligence services being provided. And so I think when I look at this decision, I'm inclined to focus on the absence of those things within the Russian system. As we all know, Russia over the last 20 or so years has become increasingly authoritarian. You have a system which is so focused on President Putin that it's very questionable the extent to which he does get good advice. There is the problem that so often occurs with authoritarian leaders that they become surrounded by sycophants. They are not given the information that they need. We can add to that also the destruction of independent institutions within Russia under Putin's leadership, including the destruction of free media. All of this reduces the flow of good, accurate information to the top. And so I see that this is part of the cause here. Putin, over the years, perhaps has been convinced by his own propaganda, was convinced that Russian speakers within Ukraine on the event of the invasion would rise up and support the Russian side. Obviously, that has not occurred. And I think a final point on this is also to do with the Russian intelligence services themselves. They have retained a reputation for efficiency, ruthless efficiency. But I think we can also call that into question. It seems that the intelligence services of Russia clearly failed in preparation for this. There is the story that many people will have seen. The intelligence services told Putin that they had succeeded in recruiting a lot of key assets within Ukraine, within the media, within politics, within the military. And in actual fact, a lot of those resources supposedly to recruit those assets went into the pockets of the intelligence services and fell victim to Russian corruption. And so I think for all of those reasons, that was a major cause of this huge mistake by the Russian side.
Okay, thank you very much. So it's basically you're saying that it's the failure of the Russian decision-making, get the accurate information. Putin was like a naked king. He was not getting the information that he needs. Okay, thank you so much. Kyoko, what is your view on this?
Okay, thank you. So as Ben said, there are many factors, but I want to emphasize that Putin was not happy with the security situation surrounding Russia. So he tried to change the status quo by force. As most of you know, in the post-Cold War period, NATO expanded its membership to the Eastern European countries, which once belonged to the Soviet bloc. NATO expanded its membership in 1999 and 2004, and then included many former Eastern European states. In contrast, the Warsaw Pact led by the Soviet Union was dissolved. In the course of the NATO expansion, Russia felt threatened and surrounded by hostile states. Moreover, CIS states such as Georgia and Ukraine gradually leaned towards democracy, showing the desire to join NATO. These moves were not acceptable for Russia because it desperately needed Georgia and Ukraine on its side as a buffer zone. Russia has been afraid of sharing the border with NATO members. So Ukraine's membership in NATO and Ukraine's Westernization should be blocked by all means possible, including military means for Russia. So the Euro-Maidan revolution as a trigger in 2014, Russia annexed Crimea and invaded Eastern Europe, Ukraine, to stop its tilt towards the EU and NATO. Since more than 75% of people in Crimea and Eastern Europe, Eastern Ukraine speak Russian as a mother language, Russia regarded these areas as under its sphere of influence. But due to Russia's behavior that ignored Ukraine's territorial integrity and violated the international law, Ukraine's search for NATO and EU membership ironically gained momentum. For instance, in 2019, it revised the constitution and wrote its determination to seek NATO membership. It also deepened the relationship with the United States and NATO. Moreover, despite Russia's request to NATO to promise not to expand further, NATO refused to deny its intention for expansion. As a result, Putin resorted to war to change the status quo.
Okay, thank you for your thoughts. So you're basically arguing that the NATO expansion was the main cause. Putin was not so happy about that. Great. Okay, Medlir, what is your view on this?
Okay, well, thank you, and thanks for asking me ahead of board because I was afraid that we have my argument, so I wanted to take his argument. I assume, and then let him refine it. I first of all appreciate the comments that were made before me. I do want to, I think, make an initial distinction between immediate causes of conflict and long-term structural causes of conflict. And I agree absolutely with the speakers that the immediate causes of conflict, as they put it, are perhaps malfunction of the institutions within the Russian state, although I'd argue that on that particular case, that perhaps explains better the lack of efficiency in terms of the intervention in Ukraine rather than why the decision in Ukraine. Only now, 2 or 3 months later, in hindsight, do we think that from Putin's perspective, the intervention in Ukraine is the wrong one. Everybody assumed at the time that Putin, in fact, would have been better off intervening, meaning that he would have come out of that conflict stronger. So if that's the case, then I think we have to look when we position and locate this reasoning. Perhaps the malfunctioning, so to speak, of Russian state institutions, domestic kind of explanations of this crisis, explain better the lack of effectiveness of intervention rather than the intervention itself. If we then also take the argument about the NATO expansion, which I think is very much a legitimate one, that again, I think brings into focus the more immediate, so to speak, incentives perhaps for Russia to act. But it does not address one big problem, and that is that with or without Russian, NATO extension and expansion in Ukraine or Georgia, Moldova, NATO was still a behemoth, so to speak, at the border and a threat when it came to Russia. So with or without Ukraine, with or without Moldova, with or without Georgia. So that's the first implication here. And secondly, that in fact, Russia has been for some time in what I'd call historic decline. And the way I personally see it is I see that Russia in the 21st century has the same problem that Germany had in the 19th century. And that was, it was too big and throughout the 20th century, really, it was too big not to be threatening to its neighbors, but not big enough to actually not to deter others from coming after Russia. And as a result, there are two options for Putin, but really anyone that would take over Russia. And that would be number one. You could have a future like France, right? So you could be a little power, once in a while punching above your weight. You have your nuclear weapons, you can make threats once in a while. You have a particular limited sphere of influence, much like France does in the world francophone, especially in North Africa. But meanwhile, be pushed left and right by the United States and by China, increasingly so. Or the alternative is to compete with the United States and China at a superpower level. And that for that to happen, you must also be equipped with the same kind of power, both economic, military, and I'd add here demographic, which has been also on decline when it comes to Russia. So the only way for Russia, right, to compete, if you're going to choose the second option, which it seems that that the current administration in Moscow has opted for, is to take the action it's taken. That is to continue to push out its influence. First of all, to dislodge the United States from Europe. This was kind of like the initial salvage of that. And then, of course, to reassert yourself as one of the three major powers in the international system. In hindsight, that's cost Putin most likely. We'll talk about the implications. But it seemed like an actually pretty good plan if, in fact, you wanted to compete with the big boys or the big girls. But in this particular case, the alternative would have been, like I said, be a France or Great Britain, increasingly declined relative to other great powers. So why intervene? Because it had to. There was no other option, not because of NATO expansion, not because of some, sooner or later, Russia, if it was to regain its position internationally, if it was to compete in the future dominated by the United States and China, it also needed to regain the initiative, increase geographically, whether formally or not, increase demographically, and increase economically. And the only way to do that is by an expansion of its sphere of influence throughout Eastern and Central Europe.
Thank you very much. That's an interesting view. So you're essentially arguing that the Russia is in decline. And in order to maintain its great power status, it has to keep expanding. So it's more like an imperial expansion.
It is not an imperial expansion. It's actually a balance of power and a great power competition. That is, that it's not just that it's in decline, but even if it maintains the current status quo relative to the United States and China, it will continue to decline. As a result of that, there is pressure upon Russia to also increase in power, and that creates pressure for expanding.
So do you think this is a preventive war for Russia?
It certainly is an attempt at creating an atmosphere and environment that is more conducive to its long-term interests. Yes.
All right, thank you so much, Medlir. Next, we go to Orr.
So, thank you, first of all. I've been watching the meeting, we all have. And in fact, we see two main narratives. First narrative is the Western narrative. It's not our fault. It's evil Putin, incompetent Putin, which, by the way, all these explanations about information processing cannot explain the amazingly successful decision-making when it comes to Georgia, when it comes to Syria, and yet here he failed. Oh, because everything is flawed in the system. Well, if everything is flawed in the system, how come he failed only this time? It could be because, hubris was created as a result of all the other successes, but still, the main thrust of that narrative, the Western narrative, is Putin is afraid of Ukraine becoming democratic, because then people would look at Russia and say, hey, we want to be just like as successful as Ukraine. And hence, it's a kind of a liberal narrative, mostly fear of regime security, mostly fear of globalization, as well as bad advice, as well as Putin desiring revenge for the greatest political disaster of the 20th century with fall of Soviet Union. But the bottom line is, it's not our fault. We've done nothing wrong in the West. It's all about Putin and his dreams or malfunctioning system or his fears of regime security. Not our fault in the West. That's what you see on BBC, CNN, constantly. I mean, it's actually frightening. It feels like propaganda. It really does. I watch BBC and I feel like indoctrination. I feel like it's Soviet Union. This is BBC for God's sake. This is not even CNN. CNN is true from that, but BBC has resorted to that. So that's frightening. The other narrative, I would call it, it's actually not being heard too much. Yes, you've got Mersheimer talking about NATO. You've got Stephen Cohen, Emeritus from Princeton. The kind of Putin did it because he was pushed to a corner, right? It's not just that extension of NATO. It's more your great power. You need a sphere of influence, and we remember what Victoria Nuland did back in 2014. And Victoria Nuland understands what sphere of influence is. She's married to Robert Kagan, for God's sake. She delivered money, cookies, I forgot what else, to the Euromaidan young people who obviously want to join the EU. All the young people want to join the EU and hopefully emigrate from Ukraine. I'm sorry, I'm being blunt. It's not nationalism. It's the desire to emigrate to London or Berlin or somewhere else. So obviously they were in Euromaidan very much easy to trigger by the liberals, by America. That's a story that's not being heard in the media, and that's unfortunate. Because we want to know, are we at fault for what he did? Did we push him to a corner? Because we know Putin actually tried to negotiate well ahead of this war. He went into Venezuela and said to the US, I can go back and get out. Would you please make concessions on Ukraine? He went into Syria, again, turned to Obama and said, I'm willing to make concessions. Would you please make concessions on the issue of Ukraine? We'll trade Syria for Ukraine. We didn't even ask ourselves, how the hell did we lead to the rise of Putin, which of course the West did. Well, specifically Clinton did, right, by supporting Chechen terrorism and so on. So I think that there is a room for a lot of rethinking. I'm not saying that all the evidence is in the Putin narrative, but there is a lot of room for fault for the West here. a lot of room for blame. And I agree with you, James. There's a lot of incompetence in the Russia, a lot of corruption, incompetence, bad intelligence. But this is not the mindset. The overall mindset of Putin was probably, I had to do it sooner or later, right? I had to do it sooner or later. So I kind of agree with you, Medlir. It's sooner or later I had to do it because of this Western encroachment, right? After the EU comes NATO, but even the EU itself is kind of encroaching into my sphere of influence. Now, the real timing is actually a mystery. The exact timing, and here I go back to what Medlir said about immediate causes versus, greater structural causes. It's a mystery. End of winter, land is not frozen, tanks get stuck. The Javelin missiles would provide us really kill all the tanks. You don't need any gas, so the threat of not delivering gas to Europe is not as frightening. It's real mystery. So why did you do it now? Yes, Boris Johnson has problems. Yes, Biden is incompetent and gets angry at Saudi Arabia, which means oil prices will rise. But it is. I think it's a puzzle. The only factor I found was really interesting is it's the end of COVID-19, so there's resurgent demand for oil and gas, right? But still, it's the end of the winter. What the hell are you doing? So there's a lot of things which are unclear here. But I wish that overall, I wish the media would actually debate the factors, give some attention to the Putin narrative, and not just to the Western narrative. And I encourage people not to watch the Western media too much, not to be indoctrinated.
Thank you, Or. I think it's important that, if NATO expansion is a main cause, then NATO or the US could have done something. But if it's totally the Putin and the Russia, then nothing that the West could have done to stop this aggression. All right, Chris.
Thank you for that. And it's I guess a challenge to go at the very end, but it's also an advantage in a sense because I've been able to hear kind of our colleagues and guests begin to explore this question, and it is a very important one. But just to kind of try to answer Or's last question about why was it now and not earlier or later, and that kind of comes back to James's point about I'm guessing that kind of when the dust settles, there was a huge miscalculation in Moscow as to how long this operation would take. The assumption was that this would not be a months-long conflict that's going to require Russia to kind of mobilize its broader military strength. But the belief was that this was something that was going to end relatively quickly, and Russia would have demonstrated its strength, and the international community would have been shocked at that display of strength from Moscow. And the assumption probably was that this would have been perhaps kind of a shock to kind of Western institutions like NATO to the extent that it would have threatened the cohesion, long-term cohesion of these alliances. But I think you bring up some things, and of course it's no surprise that we probably disagree on some elements of what you were saying there. And I think the first one, and this is something that's important to consider and take at face value, not necessarily kind of media narratives, but more kind of Mearsheimer's take that lays the blame for this conflict squarely at the feet of the United States and the kind of U.S. policy establishment, and makes the case that kind of NATO expansion into Ukraine would have always caused this type of reaction from Moscow. But there are a couple of things that I think that we need to explore with that, and one of them is, well, I tend to not like counterfactuals. Right, that the question of going back to the 1990s, right, and this was a time when states emerging from the Warsaw Pact, like Poland, prioritized in their foreign policies integration into Western institutions. These included the European Union, and they included NATO. And the European Economic Communities, and later the European Union, in the 90s still saw NATO as a vehicle through which to bring about kind of security sector reform in these candidate countries and bring them into kind of broader European structures. And so it wasn't as easy to say that that Washington could have just simply said, okay, there's going to be no NATO or there's no NATO expansion. And if that was articulated, then there would have been other vehicles for US-Europe military cooperation that would have had to have been established that would have probably looked a lot like NATO and drawn on NATO infrastructure for US-European military cooperation in places like the Balkans and peacekeeping missions and the such. But at the same time, right, there is a lot of creative thinking that could have been done in the 1990s in relation to seeing Russia find a place in this new post-Cold War world order that did not rely on kind of some of these kind of more easy to find answers that did draw on kind of past understandings of Cold War alliance politics. In addition to that, another thing to keep in mind in relation to Ukraine and kind of the question of kind of why now is if we go back to 2014 in Maidan, which Orr had mentioned, this was about a stability and association agreement with the European Union. This was not about NATO. If you think about NATO, at Bucharest summit in 2008, Germany had said no, right? And Germany's position had not really significantly evolved over these years. There was no prospect of near-term integration of Ukraine into the NATO alliance. But there was deepening economic integration into the European Union. And you see this in countries like, for example, Moldova, where most of Transnistria's trade, right, a occupied territory on the territory of the Republic of Moldova is going towards the West, right, in terms of investment. So deeper integration, economic integration into the European Union. And this is, and there's a bigger story here, right, in terms of what exactly Moscow poses. And kind of to put this into capsule summary form, I would argue in a way, kind of whereas Medlir sees this as not necessarily an imperial project, this is great power politics. I would suggest that in some respects there are some parallels, right? They're very different, but in terms of thinking to imperial projects like the project to create a greater Serbia in the 1990s. And if you think about the answer why Ukraine, and yeah, we'll disagree on this. But if you think about the motivations behind this, this is also a challenge to Ukrainian statehood, right? And this is about reintegrating territories that some in Moscow have not reconciled themselves to ever having lost. And therefore this is bigger than NATO. This is bigger. It's not necessarily kind of about NATO as an immediate cause, but this is about a restoration of it's a state building process. And that's what we are seeing. So some of the other parallels that you mentioned are interesting, but nonetheless, I would kind of push back a little bit against how Moscow sees Ukraine, and also that has implications for some of the other questions too about kind of where do we see this ending, and also how does Moscow see its role in the post-Soviet space.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think 30 minutes have already passed. This is just the first question, and I know some of you would like to respond, but let me. Before moving to the second question, I would like to ask a follow-up question. I think all of you have pointed out either structural reason like NATO expansion, balance of power, or Russia's domestic political, structure. How about individual level, namely Putin himself? How much do you think Putin is responsible for starting this war? I'm asking this question because if you focus on structural or domestic political reasons, then whoever was in power, Russia would have done the same thing. But if Putin was the main cause, then if somebody else was in power, maybe this invasion would not have happened. What do you think about this?
I think I already answered. Anyone who would have had a string of successes, because Russia was magnificent. Russia was amazing. Knew exactly how to intervene in Syria, save Bashar al-Assad. When Obama said, "Don't worry, history will take care of it," right? He knew exactly how to take care of Abkhazia, Georgia. He knew exactly how to Chechnya, a success story from a Russian perspective. I mean, anyone who would have had this string of successes, I think would have had a little bit of hubris by this point. And I think the problem is for every dictator, so this has nothing to do with Putin. Another problem, the more you grow old, others look at you with awe and kind of tend to accept or not challenge your point of view. So I think there are dictatorship dynamics here, which we've seen with Hitler, we've seen with so many other dictators over time, that kind of bedeviled old dictatorships. Nothing to do with Putin in particular. I think the only problem with Putin in particular, he's an intelligence guy. He's not a military guy. If it were a general, I have high admiration for generals, more than intelligence people. I think that he would have made sure that the ground forces were ready. Because this is a failure of the ground forces more than anything else. He would have examined things and not trust his ability to corrupt the right people in the right places, which is an intelligence tool. So I think a general dictator, rather than a KGB dictator, I believe would have been much more competent in this case.
Okay, so it's a
That's
dictatorship.
my
All right, thanks. Anybody else about this question? How much should we blame Putin for this war? Yes, James, please.
Just briefly, yeah, I think from what we're able to see Putin as being absolutely central to this and very much taking this decision to a large extent on his own. The ground forces, as we mentioned, were very unprepared for this. It seems that they believed that this was coerced diplomacy in the months before the invasion. And so they were deeply unprepared, actually carrying out this operation, especially the part of it pushing south from Belarus towards Kyiv. And other key figures such as Narishkin, who's the head of foreign intelligence, Shoigu, seem to have been really quite peripheral to this decision. So yes, Putin seems to have been absolutely central.
Yes, Medlir.
So again, the thing we're talking about, you need a decision-making process and decision to go to war now instead of 10 years ago or 10 years from now. Remember that in my kind of outlook on this, I outlined two possible choices, right? One is a great power status, competing United States and China in the future. The other one is a middle power status, right? I think that, the decision, or these two choices are structural. I mean, you can't do anything about that. Russia, those are the two choices it has. The decision, right, to pursue one versus the other, certainly then you dip down to the domestic level or individual level. And perhaps Putin here obviously has an important kind of, maybe a Yeltsin may not have pursued a similar policy. But do I see, let's say, a Navalny presidency, right, saying, yeah, I'm going to join the NATO and I want to be friends with the United States? No, I don't, right? Because, again, these kinds of dynamics exist in the region. So I'll stay with it.
I would just say that in relation to the responsibility for this war, obviously Putin, as the president of the Russian Federation and the commander of the Russian armed forces, is responsible. If you look at this from like a perspective of kind of international criminal responsibility, right? And people are talking about that, and that's something. There are ongoing investigations. The International Criminal Court is involved. Many different jurisdictions are also carrying out investigations, right? That obviously Putin also is there. But one small thing, because you mentioned domestic level variables, Akitoshi, is that I had not mentioned at the very beginning, though, is that we tend to forget that just as early as last year, there were some of the largest demonstrations across the Russian Federation in a decade in support of an opposition leader, Navalny, who had returned to Russia after having kind of recovered from medical treatment in Germany. And so we can't necessarily underplay the extent of regime insecurity in that particular context. And you can see a lot of the repression that's happening now in relation to shutting down domestic media and targeting those as well. We can see that in that context. But Medlir is right.
Why would it lead to an invasion of the country? I mean,
Well, no, it would lead to domestic repression, but it leads to a greater sense of insecurity. And I think that the reason why we are seeing this is going back to 2014 and some of the things that Laura is talking about, right? Why Putin was very popular in many parts of the world, why kind of Putin was seen as a kind of strong type leader in countries very far away from Russia, like in Egypt and other parts of the Middle East, to even parts of potentially Southeast Asia. That given the constraints that Russia faces, that without reconstituting this kind of post-Soviet space in the face of greater integration into the West, that as you said, Russia was going to be kind of as believed under the kind of the Obama administration. Russia was upset that it was referred to as a regional power, right? And it is as James said at the very beginning, right? It can be seen as a horrific, catastrophic miscalculation, right? That this is not a war that was planned for, that was widely known, even kind of internally, kind of among those who are now tasked with carrying out this armed conflict. So in that sense, the question of why, right, is answered in the sense that if you draw your legitimacy kind of on this kind of stature, your legitimacy comes from this. And this is challenged, right? That these things take on a greater importance, and that's why this conflict, I would argue, is probably of greater importance to Moscow now, in terms of seeing it through to a end that Moscow can at least claim some sort of, I guess not to use the word victory, right? But that some sort of something has been achieved through this. Because right now the costs have been catastrophic.
All right, I give you 1 minute, and then we have to move on. Okay. Kyoko, go ahead.
I think Putin plays a role, however, limited factor. So Putin is contributing factor, but not the whole factor. The reason is because international structure, that means NATO's expansion, actually occurred. And Russia wasn't happy about that. So even in the 1990s, still Putin was not, getting to power. So even in the 1990s, Russia showed deep displeasure about NATO's expansion. And Russia urged NATO to change the direction again and again. But NATO actually appeased Russia, because NATO needed Russia's cooperation to deal with terrorism and also Afghanistan. And also another reason is Putin is elected by the people. So of course, election in Russia may not be appropriate, and we cannot call Russia's election as election, but still, they conduct elections. So even without Putin, I think Russians might have chosen a different person. However, with a very strong leadership. So that means people might have chosen a different person, but with a strong leadership and this, same way of thinking. So that means different leader might have, done the same thing.
I see. Okay. Or you wanna?
I just want to say that
Yes.
I don't buy the diversity war thesis rooted in domestic politics. I think the COVID created damage in Russia, no doubt, but Sputnik was effective. This is not China where the medicine is completely ineffective. And I think Putin saw an opportunity. He saw an opportunity. The West has been failed for years. Olaf Scholz is verstehen, and he's from the SDP, not CDU. And Boris Johnson, of course, had this party, rebelling against him. I think he saw an opportunity. So it's a story of opportunity more than a story of grievance. It's an opportunity story rooted in past grievances, but immediate opportunity really played a role.
Just one very quick kind of response to some of these. While structure, of course, plays a role, I think one of the questions that we have to ask is that had Putin did nothing, both NATO and the European Union were experiencing or in significant crisis. I mean, you had the president of France having referred to NATO as brain dead. NATO expansion was already stalled. The European Union's common foreign and security policy was also experiencing significant challenges. You had Brexit, the UK had left. And if anything, the consequence of this invasion has been to strengthen these organizations that Moscow supposedly feared so much that it had to invade the neighboring country of Ukraine.
Yeah, Medlir.
I just wanted, just for clarity, there are two structural arguments being proposed here in addition to the other. I disagree with the NATO expansion argument. The structural argument I propose is one that is independent of NATO because the changes are marginal. They're very small. And they also lay the blame squarely at one particular actor rather than just broader structural forces in the area. And so if that's the case, then this explanation as well does not in a way undermine my argument. Because it's not about the weakness and the strength of NATO. It's about Russian competition with the United States and China. It has nothing to do with Europe. Europe is a non-factor. And so if you're going to compete with these powers in the future, you must also have the resources to do so. And that has nothing to do with NATO expansion or not. NATO expansion is just an excuse and nothing more than that.
All right. Thank you so much. And we have to move on to the next question. And that is, what are the prospects for ceasefire? As I said, this conflict has been going on for over 2 months. And I think the objective of Russia has changed. I would like to, get your opinion about how Putin has defined Russia's main objective of, invading Ukraine. Regime change or territorial gain or Ukraine neutrality? And how is this war likely to end in your view? Okay, or let's start with you.
So I'm going to be cynical. Why stop the war? We're winning. The West is winning. Even Biden enjoyed bipartisanship, as Chris pointed out correctly. The globalists in the international relations, the pro-globalization guys are winning, right? Macron is winning. Viktor Orban is losing. All the people who are more nationalists and isolationists, the Trumpists, let's call them, are losing, right? This has been a victory to the pro-EU people, not to the Eurosceptics, to the Atlanticists, to the Democrats in the US. Why stop the war? We can bleed Russia until the last Ukrainian migrates or is dead. So I'm being a bit cynical, but I think Blinken is a realist. He's a good realist, and he will exploit Ukraine to the utmost. So why stop the war? Send them more javelins, send them more artillery, send them everything we can. Having said that, Putin, of course, knows he's trying to play the game that I will be more brutal. If you support Ukrainians to such an extent, I will actually use chemical weapons. I will use so many things you don't even want to know. So to stop this game. So the quagmiring causal mechanism, because this is the strategy of the West, quagmire Russia, has its issues because Putin is not going to play along. He's going to escalate.
You said the West is winning.
Of course.
But do you think that at some point Putin may be compelled to use larger, more explosive?
Escalate. Of course, he will escalate in order to stop this support for Ukraine.
So what would you then do?
If I were the West?
Yes.
Well, chemical weapons, I didn't see them. I would fight to kill the last Ukrainian. Until the last Ukrainian either migrates or is dead. I mean, Lincoln is doing it right now. Lincoln is a good realist. He belongs to the Democratic Party only by chance. He's a realist. This is not the Obama team in foreign policy in the U.S. And those who think Biden is Obama 0.2 don't see real differences.
Oh,
I think a deal is possible in the end. We lift the sanctions. You stop the war, taking only part of Ukraine, right? So this is the sanctions mechanism is one causal mechanism, right? A deal between the U.S. and NATO, EU vis-a-vis Russia on this issue. China telling you to stop, but I think overall, why stop? Why stop? We're winning. Putin at some point needs enough of a victory to declare I'm done and go home. But I think this war can continue for many, many years. And why should it stop?
Okay. Anybody else about the prospects of ceasefire and how this war likely to end? Kyoko.
So since Putin can go back to his home country without gaining a prize, he continues to attack and never gives up until he gets what he wants. A possibility of Finland and Sweden's NATO memberships make it more difficult for Putin to back down. So Ukraine also continues to fight back by using weapons provided by the United States and NATO. So therefore, war is likely to continue and Ukraine might become a second Syria. Unless somebody intervenes and mediates a ceasefire agreement. And in a ceasefire agreement, Ukraine will become a neutral state which operates as a buffer zone for Russia. And since Ukraine now understands that it cannot join NATO despite its invitation, Ukraine might accept such a deal. The mediation should be conducted at our stage, to minimize the risk of. It's based on that Ukrainians have to fight until the last. It's world.
Okay.
That's
Thank
what
you.
happened in Syria, and it worked.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Chris. Go ahead.
You know, I just, a couple things in relation to this question. One, we have to remember that we can't really see the West as kind of necessarily a monolithic bloc on this that can kind of rationally exploit the situation to degrade Russia over the course of years. We're already seeing differences emerge. I think this is a risk for Ukraine in the sense that how long can European unity among the EU member states be maintained going forward in the long term in relation to kind of this ongoing conflict in a sense that one kind of questions over kind of the speed of Ukraine's integration into the European Union is one that has already kind of provoked significant debate. Questions about Finland and Sweden's membership into the NATO alliance. While there's broad support for this in countries like Finland, there's the question of how other existing NATO member states are going to perceive this. So these are things right now that are kind of being papered over in the shock of conflict. But as this conflict goes forward, will probably grow. And in relation to a ceasefire, if there is one, it'll be tenuous, I think. One, because I'm a little bit kind of skeptical when it comes to Russia agreeing to something that has not accomplished Russia's, as stated by Putin, kind of core objectives very early on. That this is, Russia has suffered significantly as a result of this invasion in terms of personnel, in terms of losing things like the flagship kind of Moskva, that these are not going to be an easy sell for Putin if he's only grabbed some empty farmland in an economically depressed part of eastern Ukraine. And also the other factor there that will make this very tenuous is something that I alluded to early on, ongoing international criminal justice processes into atrocities that have been committed. These are things that European states can't just make go away, right? In a sense that they have independent judiciaries, and they're also Rome Statute signatory states. So without kind of undermining the entire kind of apparatus of international justice, should there be in the next months and weeks indictments of Russians who are responsible for atrocities that have been kind of committed and are under investigation, this will limit the ability of European states to engage with Russia in a way that perhaps Russia would like to be engaged with going forward. So if there is a ceasefire, it would be a very fragile one.
What do you think would satisfy Putin? The Ukrainian neutrality, or in addition to like Donbass area, the territorial gain, or the regime change?
This is perhaps what gets us into a little bit of disagreement here earlier, that I don't think that this is necessarily even about kind of the choices Ukraine has made in its foreign policy since independence from the Soviet Union. That this is about a kind of allergic rejection of Ukraine's statehood and Ukraine's own state building process. And so if there is neutrality, that's not necessarily neutrality, but that would be a Ukrainian state that is analogous, perhaps under kind of a leader like Lukashenko, right? That is kind of nominally kind of independent, but functionally part of Moscow's sphere of influence. But a strong neutral Ukraine that has military kind of security guarantees from other great powers, I would argue is potentially more concerning to Moscow than kind of a weakened Ukraine before February 24th, 2022, which was not being embraced into either kind of the European Union or NATO at any time in the near future.
Okay, yeah. James.
I think in order to understand the way that this might end, we have to look at the Russian goals as they were set out to the Russian people. And if you look in the Russian media, the main narrative which is presented is actually that this is a humanitarian intervention at the request of the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republic in order to save them from this supposed aggression from the Ukrainian side. So at one point, it might have been enough in order to have Russia go in, expand the territory that is under the control of those republics and permanently base Russian forces there. That's no longer enough. With the death of perhaps 15,000 Russian troops, and more importantly, the sinking of the Moskva, which is something which the Russian government can't cover up, that's a humiliation for Russia. Their military has been humiliated, and so now I feel that the Putin government needs more. And so that forces them to push on in the south and perhaps to try and establish this corridor which would cut Ukraine off from the sea, which would involve the taking of Odessa and then linking up with Transnistria as well. So I think perhaps escalation is more likely than de-escalation at this point.
Medlir.
I agree. I don't see right now the balance in terms of the battlefield is still unclear, and as long as it remains unclear, then the only way forward is further escalation of conflict rather than actually some cessation of fighting.
If that's the case, if Putin is not likely to compromise, then what would do you think would happen? The West providing more and more assistance. After Blinken-Austin visit, I think Biden administration is determined to support whatever they can, except for the combat troops. I think the US and NATO countries are now more determined to,
Well, this is where I agree with Orr and disagree with Chris with regards to this approach to US policy. It is true that on the European side, there is a fracture in terms of the alliance. Germany, Austria, and Hungary are clearly uncomfortable, although Germany just had a U-turn. I think because the Greens in the coalition that have put some pressure to send some heavy equipment into Ukraine, but Germany has a very uneasy kind of relationship towards this. The SPD has always been pacifist, and so it doesn't suit it. But the United States has Russia exactly where he wants it. And actually, the Secretary of Defense himself said as much. He said, look, we're going to continue this. We want to make sure that we degrade Russia's ability to do this ever again. What they mean is that we want to degrade Russia, period. right? We want to eliminate Russia as a competitor international system. And so the United States will continue arming them as long as Ukraine. And actually, to me, at this point, the reason why you continue to have an escalation in terms of fighting, kind of amplify the earlier front, it's not Putin. I think Putin at this point would be happy with some kind of security agreement with the Crimea, the land bridge, as you just described it, Donbass and Donetsk. But it's the Ukrainians that see themselves as saying, we can fight this war of attrition, we can keep going. The last war the Russians really fought like this was in Afghanistan. We know how that ended. Will continue to be, will be the end of Putin's regime. So in long term, the only way this really ends, right, is either the Europeans and Americans say, okay, we're no longer equipping Ukraine, which I doubt is going to happen because of what we just said, that it is in their interest to continue equipping the Ukrainians, or there is actually some act of sabotage, which we are actually seeing right now. Transnistria is one of them. There's some oil refineries in Russia as well, far away from the Ukrainian border, where it seems that maybe some Russian or others within Russia, or actors, domestic actors, are sabotaging perhaps even Russian military expedition. And that could cause and spell trouble for Putin himself. So maybe it could be a premature end to Mr. Putin himself, or like I said, the end of a U.S. intervention on behalf of Ukraine, which I don't see happening. So to me, it's more likely to see Putin actually being deposed or worse than actually seeing the United States stop doing what they're doing right now.
All right. I think we need to move on to the final question. That is to say, what are some of the implications of this conflict on different regions of the world, Middle East, Europe, East Asia, and or?
Let's start with actually broader picture of the longer.
Sure.
So maybe we're getting post-Cold War, right? Germany symbolized the post-Cold War era. We only care about human rights, humanitarian issues. Germany itself had no army. We do globalization and trade. We don't care about geopolitical consequences. Maybe we're seeing the end of this. Many small countries want to have nukes because they see what happens in Ukraine. NPT might be dead. They want to be at least threshold countries, if not nuclear armed countries, or get the nuclear umbrella. I mean, Poland has a nuclear umbrella. So Germany's transition. If the Germans are believing again in military issues, then a lot of other countries are going nuclear. We're seeing the end of the post-Cold War peace. Now, on the smaller issues, we've seen energy security and food security being issues. Energy security at the yen went down. I don't want to talk about other regions. I don't understand in them. I will say this: in the Middle East, Russia has been actually very much liked in the Middle East, and that's why we've seen mediation by both Israel and Turkey. Because obviously, the US played a very weird role of being the preacher who is not there to help. Preaching about human rights, but when you're being attacked, you're not helping. And of course, denouncing Saudi Arabia about human rights, but never helping it when it's attacked by Iran. Preaching without helping, not helping allies, of course. Whereas Russia doesn't stand for promoting democracy when it's impossible to promote democracy. Russia is much more realistic as an actor, not a revisionist actor. Russia has been not only stabilizing the situation in Syria, but also I think Obama saw correctly that Russia was part of the deal with Iran. And so he knew that in the Middle East, Russia actually plays a constructive role, a very constructive role, the US needs. And now, as long as this is going on, Russia will say, hell no, there's no nuclear deal. I think the Israelis are happy, but some others might be happy, like UAE. But Russia is not exactly the most negative actor in the world. And turning it into a negative actor is not useful for the US in the Middle East. One last point, of course, there is the Russian weapons industry was really hit, and a lot of actors depend on the Russian weapons industry, like India, like Egypt, many other actors. And I hope actors will stop engaging in these proxy wars of arming rebels all the time. It's beginning to be the new game of the 21st century. Arming rebels, so that it's not me, it's them, the Ukrainians, it's the Russian minority in Ukraine, and so on.
Okay.
I'm done.
Thank you. All right, anybody else about the implications?
I'm going to talk about Asia.
Okay.
That impacts Asia's security situation, which is increasing unstable due to China's attempt to change the status quo in the East and South China Sea. So two actual areas might become hotspots in Asia. First and foremost, as you know, Taiwan. China may take major action to annex Taiwan. In this case, we have to pay attention to the foreign points. First, Taiwan is the ally of the United States. Second, Taiwan's sovereign status is quite ambiguous. China has carefully observed the U.S. response in Ukraine and learned that a nuclear threat works. Since Taiwan is not a former ally of the United States is not right to intervene. Last year, U.S. President Biden said that we would respond if there was an action against a NATO ally. He also added that same with Japan, same with South Korea, same with Taiwan. Despite U.S. commitment, the degree of U.S. involvement is not clear. This may result in China's miscalculation. Moreover, Taiwan's sovereign status is ambiguous. Technically, the international society does not admit Taiwan's sovereign status by respecting China's one China policy. That is to say, China can justify its attack by arguing, oh, this is a matter of domestic politics and no intervention is necessary. So it may be a bit difficult, to adopt UN resolution and unanimous support from the international society. Plus, China is a trade partner for most of the countries and very important economically for most of the countries. At the same time, in the East China Sea is another hotspot. Like Russia, China hopes to change the status quo by force in the East China Sea. And although Japan is an ally of the United States will not exercise the right of collective self-defense automatically. So NATO is an alliance that makes an automatic response. However, Japanese alliance is not. If the United States meets domestic opposition, the United States will not be able to intervene and protect Japan's territory. So this is not a new problem, and actually, however, the Russian invasion again posed the issue in front of the Japanese and pushing the Japanese to think about their self-defense and national security more seriously. As you see, there emerged voices to increase defense spending and strengthen the military by having counterattack capability in response to armed attacks. Although possibility of nuclear sharing was denied instantly by Prime Minister Kishida, given Japan's unfriendly neighbors such as China, North Korea, Russia, Japan is likely to strengthen defense capabilities and alliance with the United States. So I have to go home, but maybe I have to do some time.
Okay, thank you for your cooperation. James.
Yeah, if I could just sort of follow on from that, really continue to focus on the implications for Japan. First of all, in Japan-Russia relations, of course, Prime Minister Abe made this a central element of his foreign policy, really trying to develop a partnership relationship with Russia. That had pretty much kind of stalled anyway under both Suga and Kishida. There wasn't a lot of enthusiasm, but now we've got a clear break from that, and there's no going back. Russia has postponed, has suspended the peace treaty talks, has cancelled visa-free visits to the disputed islands, and also there's now so much more acrimony in the relationship. We've had the deputy speaker of the Russian Duma accusing Japan of helping Ukrainian Nazis to prepare for a chemical weapons attack. We also had just yesterday, Deputy Foreign Minister Igor Morgulov threatening retaliatory measures in the case of increased US-Japan naval cooperation. So really, this relationship is only going to become worse, I think, in the months and years to come. And I fully expect that the national security strategy of Japan, which is due to be updated by the end of this year, will go from prioritizing cooperation with Russia to describing Russia as a threat to Japan's security.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Medlir.
All right. So I'll make one broad comment. You say something about international justice, because I know you
No, you
touched
can-
on it
you
a
can-
little
you can-
bit. Then I want to touch something about the Balkans. First, I think just since we've been talking about theory quite a bit here, I think one of the things that I think we've learned is that interdependence just does not matter. In the middle of this, the Germans were actually doubling down on the Nord Stream 2, and the whole idea was that this was somehow going to tie up, right? As things were getting worse, they were doubling down on this issue. So I see at least this liberal international kind of perspective about institutional building and interdependence and trade exchanges as somehow slowing down this juggernaut of war as being heavily discredited, I think, by what is going on currently in this context. I mean, there is a dense network of relationships between the United States and Russia, and that has been, even at the level of NATO kind of and Russia partnership, that obviously has not produced the results that he wanted. So I think from a broad kind of perspective, that'd be one thing. The second one is, I think we're likely to see the movement on the part of international justice mechanisms with regards to both the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court. There are some domestic processes that have already started. This is probably the first Twitter war, real, right, documented, open source intelligence, Bellingcat and others. They're pinpointing, right, all kinds of evidence. And so it's very interesting to see what role technology will also play. And so there are implications with regards to that. Finally, with regards to the Balkans, right, if I can, just say a couple of things. I actually prepared 5 pages of notes on this, on the Balkans, and I realized I could only read half of it. So I am going, if I can, go really fast.
Sure.
So first of all, the EU diplomatic chief, Josep Borrell, had warned actually that the EU bloc was worried about Russian military invasion and, action in Georgia, Moldova, and the Western Balkans. This was not too long ago. The NATO Secretary General as well had also warned in March that after Ukraine, Russia was aiming also for destabilizing Bosnia and Herzegovina and perhaps Georgia. Of course, in Kosovo, you've got this playbook that the Kremlin is ready to play with regards to what's happening in the north of Kosovo. Some have actually warned for some time about widening Kremlin proxy wars. And here I'm surprised that Orr is talking about this new type of warfare, this proxy wars. I thought that's what we did throughout the 20th century. That's what the Cold War was a series of proxy wars. I mean, I'm sure that, if you ask anybody here in Asia, there's a lot of proxy wars that took place. And I'm sure if you ask the Israelis and the Egyptians also, there are a lot of proxy wars taking place throughout the 20th century. So there's an expansion of this idea of proxy wars also in the Balkans, and especially when it comes to Bosnia and Herzegovina and in regards to Kosovo. So Russia's support actually for Serbia's position in Kosovo is creating a lot of instability because it's not allowing the two parties to come together. Incidentally, this could actually lead to a rapprochement between Kosovo and NATO. You don't have to be an UN member state to actually be a member of NATO, as long as you're willing to contribute. And of course, as long as some of the countries, including Spain and Greece, are willing to take you in. I was in Kosovo actually in March, and the moment I go into Pristina, you see all these cars, and this was immediately right after the war had started, and you have Kosovo in the NATO, like immediately after that. And so there are some clear signs that Kosovo is taking this very seriously. And as seriously, we should also take the instability in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which I actually see as a far more fragile ecosystem than actually Kosovo itself. So that's a very quick summary of those 4 pages.
Okay, thank you for your input. Chris?
First, I just kind of talking about this reminds me a little bit about when I was a undergraduate, and I'll date myself here, and that's when kind of September 11th happened.
Oh.
In terms of the broader consequences on international kind of affairs.
You were undergraduate at that time?
I guess
Wow.
depending on your perspective, right? But this was an event that at the time, when trying to make sense of it as an undergraduate student who's studying international relations, had far-reaching consequences that were much bigger than any of us could have imagined sitting in a classroom back then. And I would suggest that the Russian invasion of Ukraine in terms of its impacts on the international system is a equally, if not potentially even bigger event that will have far-reaching consequences for international politics in the coming decades. It is one that is certainly, and we've already talked about this in this panel, it is kind of really focused minds in the US foreign policy community on great power competition. And today we have only mentioned in passing the one state that Washington acknowledges as truly a great power peer competitor, and that's China, right? And what this conflict means for the future of US great power competition going forward is something that we cannot underestimate. And whether mentioned, we talk about kind of long-term degrading of Russia's capabilities through this particular conflict. But one of the things that I would go back to is that we go back to the European continent and kind of Europe's post-Cold War experience. European Union in many ways is very exposed to the breakdown in kind of this kind of global economic order, right? Because if you think about a country like Germany, Germany has benefited a lot. It got cheap energy from Russia to fuel German production, to sell things to kind of this parts of the world like Japan and China, and in return was getting products from China. And this change in Europe's energy security strategy that we're going to see is going to have far-reaching consequences internally, distributional consequences internally among EU member states, some of which are much more exposed and some of which are less exposed. And while right now we do see kind of a rallying behind European unity in a sense that the European Union has done things that would have been unimaginable last year, this isn't going to be easy to maintain this coalition going forward, particularly if the consequences, the economic consequences, the sanctions compliance consequences get worse. And it's not only something that affects Europe, but it's going to affect the US's relationship with countries like India and also potentially countries like Vietnam in the long run, as you see kind of drawing parallels kind of back 20 years ago, right? This dividing line becomes one where it will be very difficult for countries to balance that wish to maintain a good relationship with Moscow and potentially a good relationship with Washington. So in short, the consequences are big.
Okay, thank you so much for your insights and comments. I think now we would open the floor for free discussion. If you have any questions to ask our panelists, let's start with the students and people on the floor first, and then I ask people watching this via webinar to join us. So first of all, any question from the floor? Yes, please identify yourself and your institution, affiliation.
Hello, and thank you very much for all your comments and speeches. I think they were very insightful. My name is Arthur. I'm a fourth-year IR student at TIUGD. My research interests are actually linked to my region because I'm from Moldova. And also, my research interests are linked to Japan-Russia relations as well, especially innovation of Northern territories. So I have two questions. I'll ask the first one, and then I hope later maybe there's time for the second. We'll see. So my first question is actually about Japan-Russia relations in this conflict. So there's this character I would like to say, but it's really a mystery for me. It's Deputy Muneo Suzuki, who I really do not understand. So basically, he is a very pro-Russian representative. He is like a pro-Russian lobbyist. People might say in Japan. He was a very big advisor on Russia during Abe's premiership and by consequence during the current premiership. But at the same time, he's also very pro-Israeli, which is not that common in Japan. And he was actually leading the narrative for most of the time, but now he finally has been kind of silent. So could you explain, who is this character? Is he like an asset of Russian intelligence, or on the opposite case, maybe like the voice of reason?
Yeah, it's an interesting.
Professor Brown would be most
Yeah, so I've written an article about Suzuki Munio, so I'm happy to comment. Yeah, he is a fascinating individual, was influential within the LDP, but then ended up in various corruption scandals, was sent to prison, but then made this extraordinary political comeback, which had a lot to do with Abe. Abe, even when Suzuki was still banned from political office as a result of that conviction, Abe began to consult him as an informal advisor, and then they had these monthly meetings in order to discuss Russia policy. You mentioned that is there a possibility that he's an agent of Russian intelligence? Well, I don't think we should make those accusations without evidence, but some of his actions do lead some people to have some concerns. He is very pro-Russian. He says that it's simply on the basis that we must cooperate with our neighbor, especially in order to get a territorial deal. But if we look at his blog postings, he has blamed the invasion of Ukraine on Ukraine itself, on Zelensky for taking provocative actions. He's echoed a lot of the Russian media narrative about the conflict as well. So there has been quite a lot of pushback from the Japanese public, and I think that's why he's become quieter over the last few weeks. It's also likely that his meetings with Kishida will come to an end. He held 3 of those. The most recent was the beginning of February, but there hasn't been one since then. So I think perhaps his influence has come to an end for the time being, and we might see a lessening of his voice. But having said that, his daughter, who is a member of the LDP, is the Vice Minister, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Thank you for your.
Yeah. And we can allow totally different questions. Hopefully, we have time. So my question is actually just, I think, to Professor Lamont and Professor Mama. It's a question about frozen conflicts. So most scenarios that target right now the end of war in Ukraine, except for like total Ukrainian victory. Most scenarios assume the appearance of new quasi-states. That would be the Kherson, Popular Republic, the Lugansk, Donetsk maintained. Worst case, it could be also Kharkov. Yeah. So I'm wondering, like, do you think this poses dangers that analysts are not thinking about right now? Because you mentioned, for example, legal obligations for neutrality and non-adherence to NATO or EU. Well, there is no need for such legal obligations because factually, these frozen conflicts have already been seen as a deterrent to this joining, for example, Moldova and Transnistria. So I'm thinking, don't you see that the potential of appearing of new quasi-states would basically put an end to any, pro-European ideas?
If I could perhaps start, having explored this a little bit in the context of Transnistria, you're absolutely right. These frozen conflicts have given Moscow a lot of leverage in these countries to the extent to where it's not in Moscow's interest to see a settlement that would kind of bring Transnistria, even under significant autonomy, into the fold. And likewise, there was a piece that I've written quite some time ago about the future of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics as they were quite new, and it definitely took that into account that this gives Russia, right? This effectively was blocking Ukraine's accession into the European Union and NATO. That after the experience of Cyprus, the European Union was not going to add any new members that had ongoing territorial disputes. Likewise, it made it impossible. And so there would be significant risks to the future of Ukraine's kind of integration into any of these structures if there is an agreement that would bring these republics into existence. But in the short term, or I guess in the long term, I guess we could say, is this what Moscow wants at this point, right? Moscow already had that leverage. And if you are thinking about, you can talk about kind of total Ukrainian victory, right? And that the scenario that you're saying is not really taken into account, that not only does Ukraine prevent Russia from kind of expanding its territory in the coming weeks, but somehow pushes Russia back. Well, one, this would probably result in this, something that's been discussed earlier, and rather than de-escalation, escalation from the perspective of Russia, and the pursuit of continued pursuit of the war aims that were originally stated for Ukraine. Although Moldova's situation is different in this context.
Yeah, each of the frozen conflicts, I think, serves a particular purpose. In this particular case, I agree with Chris that I don't think that frozen conflict for Ukraine is what actually Putin wants at this point. The purpose of that land grab is to actually connect Crimea to the rest of Russia, create a land bridge, and I think that Putin would want that outright. And under ideal circumstances, that is exactly what we'd like to accomplish. It would also be, kind of like it'd be a greater Black Sea power, by the way, right? So there is completely blocking off. If you took also Odessa, you'd be blocking off all of Ukrainian access to the Black Sea, and Russia would be definitely, much more powerful in that area. I don't see Ukraine giving up on those land claims. The only thing that I see compromising on is perhaps Crimea, but beyond that, Ukraine, as currently constituted and with current kind of dynamics, I don't see them agreeing anything like that. I don't think frozen conflict will do anything for food.
Okay. Anybody else would like to ask questions to the panelists? Yeah, Barry, go ahead.
Thank you, Professor, for being roundtable. I'm very much roundtable. My name is Honig. I'm from Vietnam and I'm from here. I actually have two questions. One is from me and another is from a friend of mine.
Sure.
So my question is actually related to the implications of this conflict in the practical alliance in Asia. Because right now we have one, which is the informal alliance between the US, India, Japan, and Australia. With the recent divided stance on the Russia-Ukraine war, how do you think that countries such as India how will India resolve this issue? That's the first question. And
Sure.
A friend of mine wants to know, why are there escalations right now in the conflict, despite efforts of negotiation for peace? Is it a face signature of Putin? And what would be your opinions on a negotiated peace and possibly turning eastward instead of focusing on Western actors? And by saying eastward, it means having Eastern countries being the parties to negotiations instead of having a focus from the West.
Yeah, go ahead, or.
I will just point out that I wasn't surprised by AUKUS, but I do expect Australia. There's an internal debate in Australia. Should we go nuclear? And I think the incentive for Australia now to go nuclear increases. Because alliance is good, AUKUS is good, but looking into the future, the use of force has been proven to be highly important, and nobody's going to protect you. So I think it's a possibility that we'll see Australia going nuclear, and that means that Australia will need perhaps less India and Japan. Although I think that Japan itself will probably have a debate at some point more about the threshold, not nuclear, threshold, or nuclear in the basement of, I don't know. The second question was about involvement of East Asian actors in this conflict. Is that correct? I think this is, we spoke with me and Yanta before that the US is now concerned about China. And of course, Russia connected with China, and it's a big concern that Russia will connect with China. And I think that it's important somehow to persuade Russia not to turn to China. And which is, you need some independence from the US in order to somehow persuade Russia to become a little bit less pro-Chinese. And some actor needs to step up and do that. Now, Japan is so dependent on the US that I don't see Japan going forward and doing that, unfortunately. So that's my take on it.
Just very briefly, I think that was basically what I'll be trying.
Of course, of course.
And it didn't work. And I think the reason was because because from the Russian point of view, Japan wasn't seen as an independent actor. It was seen as an extension of the United States.
Exactly.
Okay. Jeff, do you have questions from the webinar audience that you want to share with us?
Yeah, we do have some questions from our Zoom viewers, so let's take them at once, and then we'll turn to our panelists for response. Benjamin Swan, a student here at TIU, asks what differentiates the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003 and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think this question comes from the view that both invasions are pretty similar, at least in terms of their rationale. Or do you think there is false equivalence to argue that the Russian behavior now is the same as the U.S. behavior in 2003? Another question from Juan is, how do you think will this war end? How will a Russian victory look like? Or how will a Ukrainian victory look like? And regardless of the outcome, what do you think is the biggest impact of this war to the international system? Another question from the last scene. What would be a long-term impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine to the global economy? And then from Hannah, how will the Russian invasion of Ukraine shape global security for years to come? Since we don't have other questions, let me just ask my own question.
Sure.
And I'm curious about the nuclear element.
Yeah.
Because in announcing the invasion itself, Putin emphasized Russia's standing as, quote, one of the most powerful nuclear powers in the world. And in that same statement, he said that those who try to oppose Russia could face, quote, consequences greater than any of you have faced in history. So one curious question comes to mind. Is that an indication that the Russian president is reserving the nuclear option, perhaps not really strategic nuclear weapons, possibly tactical nuclear weapons at some point, or is that not a possibility?
Okay. So we have 4 or 5 questions, and you get to choose whichever question you want to answer. You don't have to address all the questions because we don't have time. So starting with you, Or, go ahead.
So with regards to the analogy between the invasion of Iraq and the invasion of Ukraine, I think the evidence speaks for itself that the U.S. was not able to assemble in 2003 a real cohesive coalition because, Saddam didn't seem to be aggressive. He was no longer a threat. And therefore, the case for invasion was very limited. I mean, some people, even the U.S. didn't say that the truth that we need the invasion in order to topple Saddam, so that Saudi Arabia would be safe. It didn't make some sense to most actors. And that's why even Britain left the U.S. in 2008, Gordon Brown. In this case, we see actors rushing to join the coalition, which means that the moral case, the strategic logic of this case, are to say that people, the Ukrainians, who are not even provoking the others, they're not even provoking Russia, they've done nothing. They're completely innocent. They've been attacked unprovoked. And so the moral case in this is so compelling that all the actors have joined without the James Baker even to assemble a coalition. It's so glaring that this is different. This is a fight that has more strategic and moral justification in Western eyes, and that's why there's great cohesion to the coalition. I think I'll stop there.
All right, Kyoko.
So I want to talk about the impact of the global security. So I want to say that, of course, Russia will dramatically decline due to the war and also economic sanctions from the world. And European states also suffer due to the difficulty to secure the imports of national resources, such as gas and oil. And instead, China will become more powerful by absorbing exports from other countries, especially from Europe. It also continues to buy cheap gas and oil from Russia. And the US remains strong since the United States will not be damaged at all by the war. So rather, it becomes a state of democracies by providing security to other states and also natural resources to other states. So there emerges, bipolar structure. However, Asia and also Africa are not united and they do not take sides. And so that's why they are sort of independent. So I want to say there emerges bipolar structure plus one group.
Okay, that's a good point. James.
I'll take the nuclear question, if I may. So in terms of Russian doctrine, they have not, they do not have a commitment of no first use. So that has been part of their approach for many years. They also have a thing which is sometimes described as escalate to de-escalate, which is the idea that if a conflict is not going well for you, then you might use nuclear weapons in order to force the other side to back down. So how real is this concern? It's difficult to judge, of course. If you want your nuclear deterrent to be effective, you have to convince the other side that you're really willing to use them. So that means that some of the language could just be that. But there are scenarios where very much we could imagine the use of nuclear weapons, probably tactical nuclear weapons. And if you want to imagine a sort of worst case scenario, it could be that Russia would manufacture an excuse in order to use them by perhaps carrying out, let's imagine, a dirty bomb attack, a chemical weapons attack, maybe within the Donbass, blaming it on the Ukrainian side and using that as justification for use of tactical nuclear weapons in the hope that that would force both the Ukrainians and the Western side to back down. I think that would be a miscalculation. That wouldn't be what I think would occur, but that could be how this scenario could possibly escalate.
Thank you, James. Medlir.
I'm going to take up again the question number one from a different perspective, because always looking at this question of, okay, how does the U.S. Acting currently. I think perhaps another way of looking at that question is the legal case, right, from an international law perspective, the same for U.S. intervention in Iraq and for Russian intervention in Ukraine, substituting the U.S. with Russia, right? So in this case, both of these guys are the aggressors. And I think that the jury is still out, obviously, in the Iraq war. I personally oppose it for obvious reasons. But there are some, there are at least two arguments to say that, to say that they're actually not the same. One is this false equivalency, argument that was just pointed out, and that is that, the fact that even if, right, the U.S. intervention in Iraq was an appropriate one, that does not justify, right? So two bad does not make one good. It does not justify Russia's intervention in Ukraine. But secondly, there seems to be also a distinction, and I actually know I was paying attention early in the invasion of Ukraine, that has dissipated since, but the first days of it, where Russians were talking and were trying to instrumentalize various U.S. Security Council resolutions, and they were trying to use the same language that the United States used in the run-up to the Iraq war. And the reason why they were doing that is because actually the U.S. argument was at least somewhat sort of credible, at the time in 2002, 2003. And the reason for that, because there was actually a string of U.S. Security Council resolutions, right, that actually would have authorized the United States when intervening in Iraq, in principle, did not necessarily need, right, the UN Security Council. At least that was the argument that was proposed at the time. Whereas in this particular case, when it comes to Russian intervention in Ukraine, it is very clear there's absolutely no legal ground, despite what Russia has protested. I think, again, that stopped actually even arguing that legal argument even exists anymore. And so I would say that on those two counts, one on the on the equivalence kind of argument, and secondly on the fact that the U.S. intervention in Iraq was based on U.S. Council resolutions, whereas Russian intervention in Ukraine was not. On those two counts, I'd argue that there is no equivalence.
Thank you, Chris.
Great. I think I would start because we've had a lot of responses to the first question, so kind of tie it to the third question. But rather than taking kind of either kind of a legalistic take or kind of look at Iraq in comparison to kind of other kind of interventions. Just like to kind of remind everybody that the consequence of the US invading Iraq in 2003 was a high one that the United States continues to feel to this very day in terms of damaging US credibility, damaging the ability of the United States to communicate, to be trusted even by countries that are close allies. If we go back to October of 2021 when the United States is warning its European allies, look, this invasion is going to happen. This was kind of met with incredulity by a lot of kind of European partners, in part because of a fundamental lack of trust in the U.S. And this was a war that had horrible consequences for Iraq, had horrible consequences for U.S. foreign policy, and the Iraqis didn't even sink a flagship of the U.S. Navy, right? So if we think about kind of this kind of comparison going forward in relation to the future of international security, you have Russia, which has now put itself into a very vulnerable, difficult situation that it's difficult to imagine a path out of that will see Russia restored to its position in international politics on February 23rd, 2022. That had this invasion not happened, Russia's influence more broadly would be a lot greater going forward. But on the other hand, Russia is also going to be a lot more potentially destabilizing going forward. And so rather than asking a question of kind of what Japan or the US can do to kind of pull Russia away from China, I think a lot of people are asking the opposite question: what can countries do to pull Beijing away from Moscow as a destabilizing actor in the international system?
Thank you very much. I think the time is up and we have to close our roundtable now. You know, Chris told us that 9/11 was a major factor when he was a student. For me, it was the end of the Cold War. And that was a major turning point because I was just a graduate student starting to study international relations. But, you know, many Russian specialists turned out to be Japan specialists because Japan was an economic giant, a new threat to the US. International security as a subdiscipline seemed to be ending, and a lot of people start studying IPE instead of security. Some even went so far as to say IR is over with the end of Cold War. But now, you know, the IR has become much more important. And I think Ukraine today has a lot of impact on the way we see the world. I think the, you know, subjects like alliance politics, deterrence, nuclear weapons, those may come back as a main topic in the study of international relations. And I think that, you know, we hope to come back and talk again this event, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, because it's not over yet. And I enjoyed your, you know, comments, input, and I would like to have maybe in the near future the second round of a discussion to, you know, find out more about what's going on, what IR theories are useful, not so useful. All right. Well, thank you so much for your presence, and I really appreciate your time. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you.